Hey folks, I recently moved to a new city and rather than buy my furniture like a normal person, I decided to build most of it myself from industrial scrap. This video will document the build of a side table I made from the cylinder head of an old Saturn. The design of this table is pretty straightforward. The general idea is the cylinder head is going to be a base for the design and it'll bolt to a welded frame that supports a wooden tabletop. The cylinder head will be put on top of feet that raise it slightly and protect the floor from getting scratched. Being a scrapped engine part, this casting was covered in all sorts of crap. I needed to fix that before moving forward with the build, as aside from making the assembly look butt ugly, it would also cause potential weld contamination later down the road, and would generally make assembly more annoying. I initially pressure washed the part, which isn't shown here, and then wire wheeled the entire thing. I steered clear of sandblasting, as the sort of light rough surface that I'd get if I went down that road wouldn't mesh well with the rest of the build. It would look too clean and artificial. And I'm going for more of a worn, used, industrial look. Plus, some of the TIG welds I'm going to be making a little later for the tube frame are going to be awkward. And this way I can say that the crappy welds are due to a design decision, in order to keep the style consistent, and definitely not due to my subpar welding skills. I unfortunately don't have a before picture to compare the cylinder head, but this is what it looked like after wire wielding. The next item on the agenda here was building the frame for the tabletop, which I organized into 3 subcomponents: the mounting frame, the lower frame, and the upper frame. The objective for the mounting plate was to make a flat part that covered the sharp corners of the casting and exposed its interior features, so that bolted to the machine face shown here and had enough bare surface area to weld a bunch of tubes to. I didn't have a large enough single plate of steel to make the mounting plate, so I took a series of smaller pieces from the scrap pile and just welded them together. Shown here are the cutoffs used fresh off the cold saw in the positions they'd be welded. The assembly was almost geometrically where I wanted it to be at this point, but I decided to chamfer the sharp 90-degree angles, both for safety and aesthetic reasons. After those cuts were made, it was time to deburr and clean everything prior to welding. The last step prior to breaking out the TIG welder was figuring out how to keep everything aligned and located correctly. So I first identified 2 parts on the mounting plate assembly with easily visible locating features on the casting, and these parts ended up being the angle iron brackets parallel to the length of the cylinder head. I drilled those holes first, marking them by turning the cylinder head over and center punching through the opposite side, and then I bolted those components down. I then aligned and tacked everything to them on the cylinder head, double checking the location of each component prior to welding. The camera angle made it kinda hard to see, but this is what the tacked assembly looks like. I realized just as I went to make the full welds that I missed 2 of these tacks, unfortunately. A quick aside here, you may note that the footage in this video ranges pretty significantly in quality, and the reason for that is that I started by filming everything with my phone camera, but I had some durability concerns. Maybe a grinder wheel would explode and the lens would get vibe checked by a stray piece of abrasive, or maybe I'd set the phone down on a surface I'd welded 30 seconds ago and melt the casing to slag, so I ended up buying a cheap GoPro knockoff and using that. But the problem was the battery on that camera didn't last very long, so when I spent several hours working on the build, I often ended up having to revert back to my phone. And as previously noted, I also don't have a tripod or any sort of clamp setup for my camera. It's literally just held down by gravity, so I intend to fix both these issues if I make another video. not the greatest welds in the world, but they'll do. I saw the squiggly pattern on the lower left weld in a meme somewhere, and I figured I'd give it a shot. I didn't exactly walk the cup, I just sort of freehanded it. I had to steer clear of some of the bolt holes as well, that's why one of the welds doesn't fully cover the joint. The last step here was drilling the rest of the bolts in the frame and double checking the hole locations by threading in the bolts. I forgot to video this portion though, so I guess you'll just have to take my word for it. Next up was the lower frame. The lower frame sort of narrowed out the structure, reducing the width and length, and was composed of a support structure made of rebar and scrap 316 stainless steel fuel tubing, welded to a steel plate on one side and the mounting plate I just finished on the other. The welding setup looks something like this. I used a couple of T-slot extrusions to hold the midplate parallel to the mounting plate, and since the casting was too deep to easily clamp everything down, I used some heavy steel bar stock to weigh the midplate against the T-slot in order to prevent any deformations. Locating everything turned out to be easier than I thought it would be. As it turned out, the width of my T-slot was almost perfectly equal to the distance between the camshaft bores, which made aligning everything to the center of the cylinder head's width very easy. And then after that, I just used calipers to make sure that everything was at the center of the cylinder head's width. After aligning everything, all that was left to do before welding was measure the lengths of rebar I need for the main support and the lengths of tubing I need for the angular supports, cut them out, and then clean everything. And note that the tubing is actually pre-bent. These tubing bends are all from products that didn't meet bend tolerances, so I got them. It's time to make the welds. Like before, I kept the mounting plate bolted to the cylinder head to make the tacks and then took it off to make the full welds. I used magnetic 90-degree fixtures to roughly position the rebar before tack welding it, but I obviously couldn't do that for the stainless steel. I ended up using some aluminum wire to hold the stainless tubing in place for tack welding, as I didn't need any sort of real precision out of it, and then manually bent it to where I wanted before making the full welds. And on a side note, I'm sorry for all the jump cuts here. Positioning each component was pretty awkward and it took a while, so I cut those parts out of the video to not put you guys to sleep. I actually cut out a lot more of the video than that, by the way. The reality of this work is that probably upwards of 90% of my time is spent wire wheeling, sanding, cleaning, and doing other tasks that probably wouldn't look particularly interesting on camera. But if you guys would actually like to see more of that stuff, please just let me know in the comments and I'll include it next time. It was all going so well.
What the hell is even that?
So it turns out that the regulator for the shielding gas was absolutely screwed, and after swapping it out I was back in business. And as for the porous welds, well, there wasn't anything that couldn't be fixed with a grinder and some elbow grease, so we're all good. On the subject of elbow grease, I was kind of on the fence about whether to leave the weld discoloration in or wire wheel it off. In the past I've gotten decent results going both ways, but it gives the build a very different look. I eventually decided to wire wheel everything as there is enough variety in the quality and surface finish of the steel I'm using that blending in the welds in just sort of helped everything seem a little more uniform. Next up was the upper frame upon which the tabletop would be mounted. And the first step was cutting and welding the mounting frame for the tabletop itself, and I chose to make it about 2 feet by 2 feet, and to make it out of angle iron. So I cut 4 pieces of angle iron at 45-degree angles and then just welded them together. My setup to weld this assembly to the lower frame was pretty much the same as my setup to weld the lower frame to the mounting plate, but upside down. I used a couple of scrap pieces of I-beam spacers and then just used some steel to weigh the lower frame down while I made my welds. And the angle iron was just C-clamped to the table. Locating everything was also pretty easy. I just equated the diagonal measurements at the end of the I-beam brackets as they had the same width as the midplate. After cutting my rebar, it was time to weld. I kept it to just rebar here because this part of the table had a low enough angle with respect to the horizontal that it wouldn't be easily visible under the wooden tabletop. I'm actually really happy that most of the welds here aren't going to be easily visible, especially the ones between the rebar and the angle iron. because I wanted to make sure that everything stayed aligned, so I tried to make all the tacks without moving the assembly. And as you can probably see, that forced me into some awkward positions here, so glad we're not seeing that. Now, I wasn't exactly sure what I was going to do about the table's feet. On the one hand, the cylinder head is relatively narrow, between 12 and 15 inches depending on where we're looking, and designing a base that widens out could have helped with any stability issues the table might have had. But on the other hand, no matter how much deburring and wire wheeling and filing I did, the lower edge on the cylinder head would still be a relatively sharp 90-degree aluminum corner. And were I to move it off the ground by a few inches, well, I envisioned a situation where I ended up in the Guinness Book of World Records for the single most painful toe stubbing in history. And also the table was relatively high at this point. I didn't want it to go over 24 inches, which it probably would have. And so I just decided to stick some furniture pads under the cylinder head and add anything else later on if I needed it. Before continuing on to make the tabletop, I needed to clean up the casting a little more and then clear coat everything. See, the studs on the intake and exhaust ports were still there. I was able to get some of them off, but the rest were stuck and I had to cut them off. I chose to cover the metal parts in a clear coat of Rust-Oleum. It's an automotive paint I've used in the past, and I found that it works really well with metal parts in particular. So this should protect the parts from corrosion, and I expect it will last a while. The final item on the agenda was the tabletop. I chose to make it out of walnut, as I planned to stain it, and I figured the sort of dull, dark brown walnut look would mesh really well with a metal frame underneath the wood. This was one of the only parts of the build that I bought, and I couldn't find a wide enough piece to make the entire tabletop out of one piece. So I decided to cut a series of pieces out of a long plank, and then plain joint saw, and then glue them together. Gluing everything together was a little bit of a pain, as the narrow pieces on the sides couldn't really be clamped together along their length, so I just clamped everything down in every other direction and tapped them together with a mallet. It was okay as far as I could see, and this is what it looks like after trimming off the edges and flattening with a CNC router. I actually didn't face the top, a buddy of mine at the shop did it. The spindle on the CNC was a bit out of tram, so I just had to sand everything down to get rid of the tool marks. And this was a surprisingly arduous task. It took me several hours to complete. I had to plug a few nonconformities in the wood with epoxy before finishing the sanding at 320 grit. I included the seam between the side pieces of the table. It probably wasn't necessary to epoxy those areas as the gaps were extremely small, but I figured it was good form. This is what the tabletop looked like after sanding was finished. The dents in the wood weren't perfectly covered, but it was good enough for me, and I decided to give it a natural stain and then coat it in 2 layers of polyurethane. After attaching the tabletop with some wood screws, the table was finished, and you can see it here in its resting place. Here's what the wood looks like from another view. You can still see a few little bumps in the coating, but overall I think it looks okay. I was actually expecting it to look a little more dull, but frankly I think it's actually better this way. The table is stable enough for now in terms of the base, and I can put most of my weight on one side and it doesn't fall over. But if I want to build a more stable base, I'll be sure to make another video on it. And that just about marks the end of this project, at least for now. You see, as it just so happens, I actually have another cylinder head, so I might have to partake in some further shenanigans down the line. I'll keep you all updated. Anyway, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and please have a wonderful day.